that's where people get confused, because Lyme disease, as far as a new infection with a new bacteria, is very different than chronic Lyme disease, where the bacteria have been in your body, often for a very long time. So that's where we can start talking about antibiotics and other kinds of things, and that microbe factor in general. Because if your cells are stressed from bad diet, chronic exposure to toxic substances, not sleeping, not exercising, not getting good blood flow, they're vulnerable to microbes. And that's what tips the balance to chronic illness.
Welcome to Vitality Made Simple. The following production is for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you need medical advice, call your doctor. Now, let's go to Vitality Made Simple.
Well, welcome to Vitality Made Simple. This is the podcast that equips you to feel better, look better, and to enjoy better relationships. You know, life is all about relationships, and you have more to give when you feel good. Well, it's a joy today to welcome Dr. William Rawls. He is an MD who earned his degree from the Bowman Gray School of Medicine at Wake Forest. Now, originally he was trained as an OBGYN. But you know, life has a funny way of changing things. He's an avid outdoorsman. And because of his love of the outdoors, he contracted Lyme disease. And now he is one of the world experts in this area. Originally, welcome, Dr. Rawls. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here for sure.
Well, originally I pre-ordered your book called The Cellular Wellness Solution because just of my interest in, herbal medicine. But as I got to know you through your book and your compassionate way of writing, your concise way of writing, I learned that you had actually an earlier book that we're going to talk a little bit more about today, Unlocking Lyme Disease. And that was birthed out of your own journey. And I've learned a lot from you because, in my mind, and we talked a little bit off recording, it's a new disease, but it's not a new disease. So tell our listeners about your journey initially and how you learned about this very confusing ailment.
Yeah. I think you illustrated one of the huge misconceptions about chronic Lyme disease in that introduction. I didn't get Lyme disease when I got a tick bite. I grew up in the woods. I've always been an outdoor person. I got tick bites all the time, but I never got sick. Never. I became an OBGYN because, it's bringing life into the world. It's a lot of fun. It's a healthy group of patients. But 30 or 40 years ago, that came with a very rigorous call schedule. So I had responsibilities for labor and delivery in the emergency room for 24-hour shifts, including working in the office every second to third day, every second to third weekend from Friday morning until Monday. And so I basically existed in a state of being chronically sleep deprived. Most of the time when I was on call, I was lucky if I got 4 hours of sleep. And in my 30s, I could sleep hard when I wasn't on call, catch up, and I would be fine. But as I get into my 40s, it became more difficult. I was having difficulty sleeping when I wasn't on call. And then by my late 40s, my body started breaking down, and I had all this range of symptoms. Went for testing with my conventional colleagues in the medical world, and they couldn't really find a whole lot. And the testing was variable. Sometimes my thyroid would be off, sometimes not. So, and so testing is very specific, and chronic illness is everything breaking down. So the testing really isn't that great. And we rely on the testing, but a lot of times it leads us astray. And the bottom line is I wasn't sick enough to get a diagnosis of much of anything, and they didn't really recognize Lyme disease as a problem. Eventually, I kept coming back to that. I've been bitten by ticks. It's got to be something in my body. There's got to be something that's driving this. And I finally found, that I got a positive test for Borrelia, and it's like, yeah, this is the trick. Now I can take antibiotics, get well, go on with my life. Made me sicker instead of better. And my body kept breaking down. I had heart issues. I ended up with a cardiac cath because my heart was skipping beats every second to third beat. I had brain issues, neurological symptoms. I thought I might have MS. Not quite sick enough. Testing, it really didn't reach those parameters. And I just kept going around in circles. Finally found an herbal protocol for Lyme disease. Embraced it because I was pretty desperate and I couldn't really afford or didn't have the luxury of being able to take off and do, 6 months of the antibiotics, which I had some big question marks about. Herbal therapy got me well, and it took a while, it took 3 to 5 years to completely get my health back. But I did, and I've kept it, and I've continued on the herbs, and I've had some of the most robust health in my entire life over the past 10 years. So I've been well for a long time, and that had led me on a completely different journey. I stopped practicing OBGYN. I focused more on this concept of wellness and incorporated herbs and natural therapies. I became really more like a naturopath. And started making people well. It felt really good, but it was so different than the mainstream. It really challenges a lot of things, and that journey has put me in a very, very different place of how I look at chronic illness in its entirety.
Well, Dr. Rawls, I make fun of normal a lot on this podcast because in our society, people just get used to being sick. Yeah. And they don't even notice things. So tell our listeners about some of the ambiguous symptoms they might be having, and they maybe are ignoring initially.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to ask, what's a symptom, right? So what is a symptom? It's hard to describe, right? People think, well, it's this feeling I get. I don't feel well. It could be pain. It could be, so not sleeping well, having burning in your feet, having skipped heartbeats. So there are a lot of different kinds of symptoms. And so symptom represents dysfunction in the body, right? So when we talk about symptoms, I like to take it down to an even deeper level. So your body is made entirely of cells, right? Everything in your body. I mean, we're basically a collection of several trillion cells held together loosely by connective tissue, collagen and other molecules that hold the cells together. But we're all cells. So it doesn't matter what's happening in your body. Cells are doing it. Cells make your heart beat. Cells make your brain impulses fire. Cells produce collagen or produce thyroid hormone that helps the metabolic functions of all your cells. Cells stitch us back together when we, have an injury of some kind. So everything that happens is done by cells. And all of our cells are networked together. So hormones and other signaling agents and nerves are coordinating all of those cellular functions. And our brain is sensing what's going on inside and outside the body and using nerves and hormones to change cellular functions to modify what's going on so we adapt to those conditions. And that's true of every living organism on Earth, plants, animals, everything are responding to that same kind of thing. So when you look at a symptom is specifically cellular dysfunction because the body's made of cells. So when I was having irregular heartbeats, it showed that my heart cells were stressed. So no matter what your symptom is specifically pointing to the types of cells that are being injured or stressed in some way. So two things happen when your cells are stressed or injured. One, they produce substances that activate nerves that send a message to our brain to tell our brain something's wrong. So we feel it as pain or discomfort. So discomfort is a component of a lot of symptoms, but symptoms are also a sign of cellular dysfunction. The cell is stressed or injured or damaged, so it can't do its job. It's not working. So those cells are collectively not meeting expectations. And so when you look at more generalized symptoms like fatigue, you're talking about cells throughout the body that are being stressed. So it's not surprising that if you have chronic illness, then cells in the body are stressed throughout the body. And so fatigue is one of those key symptoms of virtually every chronic illness. So that's how I see illness. All aspects of all illnesses are rooted in cellular stress, that one thing. So we have different illnesses because different cells in the body can be stressed in different ways. But that's the root of it. Cellular stress is the root of all illnesses, all chronic illnesses. Whether you're talking about chronic Lyme, multiple sclerosis, dementia, it's all cellular stress. So it's really important that we get to the root of that cellular stress.
So your overwork, basically being so stressed as a physician, was wearing down your terrain,
Correct.
Your cellular resistance, and that made you susceptible. Correct? I mean, is that?
That's basically, yeah.
And then, so that really challenges, Dr. Rawls, the testing. I mean, it's so difficult to diagnose Lyme disease. Tell our listeners about what you've learned in terms of the tests that diagnose acute versus chronic and why people are getting a lot of false negatives.
So testing works best when something is well-defined. Say you've got a blockage of an artery in your heart. That's well-defined. You break your leg. You want to know exactly where the leg is broken and which leg is broken. You have an acute bacterial pneumonia. You want to know the bacteria that's just invaded your body and is wreaking havoc in your lungs. Testing is really good for those focused things that you need immediate intervention. It's really good. But when you get past ruling out all the things that need immediate attention, the things that aren't going to get better unless you do something about them pretty immediately, then testing is used to define the diagnosis. And that's where it starts getting messy. Because when you look at that concept of cellular health, of all illnesses being a function of cellular dysfunction, what we're doing to define chronic illnesses is we're measuring the dysfunction, not looking for the causes of the dysfunction. And it's like MS. There's not one test for MS. It's this wide spectrum of criteria that involves a lot of different kinds of testing and an interpretation of an individual. So that can vary. So it's not surprising that some people might have all the symptoms but not get the diagnosis. And I found this to be true in my office as I moved more toward helping people with chronic illness. I had all these people out there that were waiting for a diagnosis or didn't have a diagnosis, and they were waiting on therapy because the diagnosis defined the therapy. But I would take them in my office and say, okay, you're waiting for that diagnosis. Let me see if I can work with you. And our goal is to see if we can get you well before you even get the diagnosis. Because when you start looking at the root causes of chronic illness, there are a lot of similarities and things kind of run together. So getting to the root causes, I think, is very valuable. And that's what's missing in our whole system for chronic illness. We're treating the causes. We're treating the dysfunction. And by the way, inflammation, that's a process. That's part of the dysfunction. If you're treating the inflammation, you're not treating the causes of the inflammation. People don't get well. So it's not surprising that 60% of our population are walking around in a compromised state that they have to be on medications just to manage their illness.
Well, and Dr. Rawls, that's what's so exciting and unique about your approach, because even in the functional medicine world, we look at inflammation as the cause. We don't look that far below that. And of
Right.
course, we're just so used to having, pin the tail on the diagnosis, and somebody getting a diagnosis and then getting a prescription or even a supplement for this specific diagnosis. And it makes me remember when I first heard about Lyme disease, it was all about antibiotics. I mean, it was about these layered antibiotic regimens that just went on for months. So I want you to define for our listeners how that actually makes things worse in the long run for the root cause.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, why don't we come back to that and let's dive into those root causes a little bit, because we're going to come back to the microbes. I think that's going to be really, really key. And so when you ask that question, what causes it? What are the root causes of illness? Where I was 20 years ago was realizing that there are a lot of common root causes. What somebody eats, that is the well-defined root causes of processed food, high meat, inflammatory diets. Those things increase risk of illness. And then we have toxic substances in the environment that we're exposed to so much in our modern world. Well, there's a lot of evidence that increases risk of a lot of diseases. Not getting sleep, that was an obvious one for me, and not getting exercise. But then there's that microbe factor. How does that fit in? So we'll come back to that. But it really boils down to this. So we've been talking about cells. So when you think about a cell, it is an isolated functional unit. You can think of your cells as little biological microscopic machines that do work. So all of our cells come from one cell. We start off as one cell, and that cell, because of that genetic program inside, differentiates into all of our other cells. But all of our cells, even though they've been modified for specific functions, basically have the same internal parts. So when you look at them as little microscopic machines, all machines have operating requirements. So your cells, every one of your cells has 5 specific operating requirements to function. And so every cell in your body has to have the right nutrients. So if you're eating a whole food diet, which is a whole cell diet, you're giving all the cells in your body the right nutrients so they can function properly, the right amount of carbohydrate and fat to burn energy. And certain cells, they need other specific things, like our thyroid cells need iodine. But if you're eating a whole food diet, you've got all your cells in your body covered. 2, cells need a clean operating environment. So what toxic substances do is disrupt the machinery of our cells so they don't work right. So all the things that we're exposed to from industry and coming out of the back of automobile tailpipes and all the other things that end up in our food and our water and our air inhibit cellular functions. That's how they harm us. Cells need downtime to recover. Cells need a good 8 hours of rest. So our cells work all day and they are constantly having to rebuild and repair. So they need downtime during the day, but especially that 8 hours of sleep at night. Now, some cells in our body, like our heart cells, have to rest in between beats. That's why our heart is so vulnerable. Our heart never stops. But most of our cells need downtime. So if you're getting an average of 6.5 hours, which is normal for Americans, you start every day with a deficit that your cells haven't recovered from the day before. And that was the big thing that happened to me. So stress, pushing that stress button, driving through modern life keeps us from sleeping. It keeps our body in high alert. It keeps our cells from recovering. Our cells need good blood flow. So when we look at physical activity, then being physically active moves blood, and that flushes away debris and congestion. So when we talk about inflammation, what inflammation is is increased die-off of cells. So when cells are stressed throughout the body, or stressed in a location like you have an injury, you have an increased die-off of cells from stress cells that have been stressed or injured. So that if it's happening faster than the immune system can clear it, that creates debris and congestion in our tissues. That's what inflammation is. So inflammation is part of the process of cellular stress. So you need good blood flow to flush that stuff away, to clear all that congestion. So that's 4. The last one is microbes. Microbes are our cell's arch enemy, but there's a lot of difference between an infection and microbes that are already in your body. And that's where people get confused, because Lyme disease, as far as a new infection with a new bacteria, is very different than chronic Lyme disease, where the bacteria have been in your body, often for a very long time. So that's where we can start talking about antibiotics and other kinds of things, and that microbe factor in general, because if your cells are stressed from bad diet, chronic exposure to toxic substances, not sleeping, not exercising, not getting good blood flow, they're vulnerable to microbes. And that's what tips the balance to chronic illness.
Yes, and we talk a lot on Vitality Made Simple about these opportunistic microbes. They're there, but all the things you mentioned, and I might add to that, Dr. Rawls, even things like anger, unforgiveness that raise cortisol are going to affect that underlying base. So these opportunistic bugs, they're silent if everything's healthy and well rested and well nourished, and kind of like Antoine Béchamp, one of my favorite dead guys, talked about the terrain theory of illness back in the 1850s. We don't have to worry so much about the germ if we keep the terrain healthy.
That's right.
So antibiotics, of course, are going to kill off a lot of the good things. They're going to result in those opportunistic things potentially overgrowing. So as you went through your journey, you started looking for other options. You were like, these antibiotics, I'm not getting well, I'm maybe getting sicker. So that made you explore herbal medicine.
Yeah.
So tell us, about the epiphanies, I think, that you reached.
The difference between the two. Yeah. Yeah, in the beginning, it was just desperation. And I thought, if these herbs really work, they're going to mess up my gut just like the antibiotics did. And they didn't. And that's when I learned some things that were really significant. And since then, I've been able to find the science that actually proves these things. Antibiotics were... And back in the 1940s, when penicillin came along, it was just extraordinary, because finally we had a tool, and tools like antibiotics and vaccines changed everything, because a lot of people died of acute infections. And a lot of people died of trauma, that they got infections that could not be healed. And so they died. So antibiotics are single chemical agents. And by the way, all antibiotics originated from nature, either a bacteria, a plant, or a fungus, every single one of them. Where, you once had this idea that antibiotics came from a lab. This smart guy, scientist, would develop this chemical that would inhibit bacteria or viruses or whatever in a certain way. Nah, we're just not that smart. We pull these things from nature. So penicillin was a single chemical pulled from a fungus. So the fungus was producing a lot of chemical substances to protect itself from bacteria. Bacteria are fungus's arch enemy. And we just pulled one of those chemicals because we're not good enough to reproduce that whole system. And we want to patent that thing so we can make money on it. So most antibiotics, all antibiotics are derived originally from a natural source. And then we modify that chemical to either potentiate it or change it so we can get a patent on it, because you can't patent natural things. Antibiotics are exceptionally good for fast-growing bacteria. That's really important. That's very, very key. So if you've got something that's invading your body acutely, an acute pneumococcal pneumonia, that bacteria is turning over very, very rapidly. And so a pneumococcal bacteria will double itself, double its growth in 20 minutes. And that means somebody can get really fast, really sick, really quickly. And antibiotics can knock that out because antibiotics depend on fast-growing bacteria. So when you take an antibiotic, you're hitting those fast-growing bacteria a lot harder than you're hitting your normal flora, so you can get away with it for about 10 days before you start generating antibiotic-resistant bugs and before you start really disrupting your gut flora. So fast-growing bacteria, it works. Borrelia, the Lyme bacteria, has a doubling time of about 12 to 24 hours, not 20 minutes. And that's in its active state. So antibiotics aren't going to work as well for those kinds of things. And there are a lot of those kinds of things. In fact, we're exposed to those kinds of things more than we're exposed to anything else. Throughout our lifetime, we're constantly exposed to tick bites and bug bites and flea bites and dog scratches and hamster bites. And, and it just goes on and on. Plus, we pick up things from putting stuff in our mouths. And so we're exposed to a lot of different things throughout our lifetime. And I once thought as a physician that, you're exposed to those things, you develop immunity to them, your immune system gets rid of them and they're cleared and you're okay. You won't hear from them again. And what my research has revealed, just looking at all of the world's research on this particular topic, is that's not the case in most cases. When we pick up things, what happens often is these things become dormant inside of our cells. And when you look at the Lyme bacteria, Borrelia, or what we call the co-infections, Bartonellas, Babesias, Rickettsias, Anaplasmas, on and on and on, you find that these things can invade the body, often very quietly, without anybody having symptoms, dig into tissues, invade cells, and become dormant. And they can stay dormant for a very long time. So microbe dormancy is well documented, is a key survival mechanism for all microbes. At any given point in time, 60% of the microbes on Earth are in a dormant state. So it's a survival mechanism. They can hang out. They can wait. And they're actually much more successful than that pneumococcal bacteria that's trying to invade your body and kill you, because if it kills you, then its host is gone. They don't want to kill the host. They want the host healthy so they can get out and spread more of those microbes. We're a platform for spreading microbes, and they know that. So when you look at the list of things, it's not a dozen microbes. It's hundreds and probably even thousands. And beyond the things that we're exposed to from outside our body, know things from your gums, things from your gut, things from your skin can enter your bloodstream and end up all in different kinds of places. There were a series of studies that serendipitously found that it appears we have a microbiome of the brain, hundreds of species of bacteria in our brain. Where do they come from? The gums, the gut, and the skin, mostly, not from outside the body. So these things are hanging out. So we're like an ecosystem. So we're learning about this now, but what we don't know is some of those microbes may actually be important. They may be favorable for cellular functions. But most of them, a lot of them, are opportunist. And they hang out there. But you go 20 years without getting sleep and not eating a good diet and all of these things that I did to stress my body, and just the aging process that affects your cells, eventually they started reactivating and they started breaking down my tissues to form a food supply to grow more microbes. And that's what chronic Lyme is. But it's also what a lot of chronic illnesses are. MS, a lot of people test positive for Borrelia, but also chlamydia and Epstein-Barr and other microbes too. And when you really dig deep, you can find microbe connections to virtually all illnesses, including most cancers. And it's really interesting, but it's not these high-grade pathogens that make you sick. It's these low-grade things that can just hang around and wait for that opportunity. And then when you do all these things and you get it, then you're in trouble.
That's a great description, Dr. Rawls, because my area of interest is Fusobacterium nucleatum, and it's a commensal bacteria, folks, which means that at low levels, it's actually a beneficial. It's just when it overgrows that it is sort of a biofilm accelerator and makes a lot of these other bad bacteria worse. I see it very consistently, Dr. Rawls, in patients who have Lyme. Say a physician who's treating a patient for Lyme or mold comes in, so far 100% have had higher than optimal levels of Fusobacterium nucleatum in their mouth, and often it has translocated to their gut where it's, made a home there at higher levels.
Yeah.
So just like you said, now is this all, are these bacteria associated with Lyme, are they all biofilm formers or hiding in the cell?
Well, you hear a lot about biofilms, and certainly in your world, biofilms that we call plaque are a big deal, and all bacteria can form biofilms. But as you also know, how a biofilm does damage and causes symptoms is by damaging the surface that it forms on. But the bacteria within it aren't necessarily directly affecting other cellular functions. They're kind of walled off. So I think biofilms are an issue, but I really feel like, when you start seeing someone that's really getting bogged down with biofilms, by then their health has deteriorated a lot. And that, and their immune system, the best defense against biofilms is a healthy immune system and healthy cells in the body. So biofilms are forming kind of when illness is more advanced, when cellular health has really deteriorated a lot. So I think the nature of these bacteria that makes them very antibiotic resistant and very resistant to treatment in general is the fact that you have this reservoir of them within cells in the body that are gradually and constantly reactivating. And that really starts to explain the symptoms of most chronic illnesses better, because if you look at that idea of your body being peppered, your brain, your muscles, your joints, everywhere in your body, all of your tissues being peppered with microbes that are living inside cells. And here, not one or two or a dozen, but probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of different types of microbes present. Very low concentrations. Not all of our cells have them. But when cellular health deteriorates, they start reactivating and they start damaging cells directly. Well, not only on top of that, if you can imagine microbes emerging from cells, well, the immune system at that point sees that and starts attacking the cells, which really antagonizes the whole situation. But that would start to explain that autoimmune phenomenon that is part of so many chronic illnesses. So the symptoms are where the cells are being damaged, where the cells are damaged the very most. And so then you start looking at, all right, if different chronic illnesses are different cells being affected, what we also know is that different microbes invade different cells in the body. Borrelia has preference for certain kinds of cells, and rickettsia has preference for certain kinds of cells. And so when you start having reactivation and disease in those particular cells, that causes a particular symptom. But if it's going on throughout the body, just fatigue and malaise is really a part of it too. So when you look at that model of cellular health and, dormant microbes being reactivated throughout the body, it really very, very eloquently explains why certain symptoms occur and what's going on with chronic illness. And then when it starts to get advanced, the bacteria start forming biofilms whenever they have an opportunity, because that, is just another defense mechanism.
So we treat these things with, anti-inflammatories or whatever, so we're not getting to the root cause at all. Very different than herbal medicine. So tell us, Dr. Rawls, as you started to make these discoveries, you were feeling worse, what herbs did you start with?
Yeah. Well, there was a regimen of herbs defined by an herbalist named Stephen Booner, who had looked at herbs for their antimicrobial properties and herbs that had traditionally been used for things that we now know were infections. But specifically, and he was looking for things that were used for infections that we now know were associated with spirochetes, that corkscrew bacteria, that not necessarily Lyme disease, but bacteria like that.
Yeah.
So he chose some of those things, and people started using it, and they started getting better. But it also didn't disrupt the gut. So fast forward a bit, just my research over the past 20 years, I've really come to think of herbs very differently than I did in the beginning. In the beginning, I was pretty naive, and it was just like, oh, maybe this will help me. Let's see. But then as I got interested in it, as I started getting better, I studied traditional herbalism, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, the various herbal disciplines. And I found that there were, where you went on earth, there was a lot of similarities. But it was mainly observational. Here you use this herbs when you have this particular symptom. But I was more interested in what the herbs were actually doing at a biochemical level, at a cellular level. So I started digging into the science, and that's what's been so interesting in the past 20 years, is we now know pretty well how herbs work. And it really boils down to this. When you look at a plant is a living organism like us. It's a multicellular organism, and it deals with most of the same threats that we face. So plants have to, their cells are being threatened by free radicals, toxic substances, radiation, but microbes of every variety. So everything living is food for something else. So plants, funguses, we're food for bacteria. And so plants have to defend their cells from viruses, from other fungi, from bacteria, from protozoa. So plants have a built-out defense system that, unlike our system is cellular, we have immune cells. Plants use a chemical system. Also, fungi use a chemical system, and bacteria have to defend themselves from other bacteria. So they're using the chemicals. But it's a system. So you remember I said, we pluck one chemical from a system to make an antibiotic. We're not getting the whole system. Well, not having that system is a big loss. So when we take an herb, we're taking the plant's entire defense system, hundreds and hundreds of chemicals that we call phytochemicals that are designed. They're there to protect the plant's cells from free radicals, from toxic substances, from things like too much carbohydrate. Oddly, phytochemicals protect us from that, but all these different kinds of microbes. But when you look at a plant, you're talking about a system. So it's not that single random chemical that doesn't have intelligence. So the plant system has a certain intelligence that is specific for pathogens, but doesn't affect normal flora, which is really key. And why taking herbs for years, I took high levels of herbs for 5 years, and I've been taking herbs for 20 years. Because it doesn't disrupt normal flora, in the gut, on the skin, in the mouth, you can take them. In fact, herbs have the opposite. When compared to probiotics or much of anything else, I've found that herbs do a better job of balancing our internal microbiome than anything else. My mouth health is better than it's been. I've always had good teeth, but my mouth health. I mean, they tell me at the dentist, man, I don't have to clean very much. Your teeth look great. And I wish I could say it's because I always brush and always floss. Yeah, I'm pretty good at it, but still, it's been better since I've been doing the herbs. My gut health is better. My skin is just robustly healthy. So the herbs are doing things. It's a cell protection system. And it's not just protecting our heart cells or our brain cells or our liver cells. It's protecting every cell in the body. So you get this robust system that you can use to constantly add suppression. So when these microbes reactivate, there's something there suppressing them constantly. And that, I think, is a big key. So it's not only valuable for chronic Lyme disease, it's valuable for everything. So you're talking about something that has a very low potential for harm, a very high potential for benefit. I mean, every one of the herbs that I've studied had anti-cancer properties. Who doesn't want that? Now here, I've been talking about herbs in a very general sense. When you look at herbs, there is a spectrum that goes all the way from food plants that we eat and culinary herbs to herbs that do have two drug-like properties that you wouldn't want to use. So all plants aren't safe for us to eat. Nobody would make the mistake of trying to use poison ivy as a medicinal, right? But there are a lot of plants that humans have been using for thousands and thousands of years that we define as herbal medicine that are very safe for us to use and have really extraordinary benefits that we all should be paying attention to.
I totally agree. And I think it's a fascinating area to start learning about. Dr. Rawls, that's why your book is informative, because it's super important to make sure you're getting quality herbs, because there's the active portion. There's probably, I'm talking as not knowing much here, but it's how they extract the active portion. You could be spending a lot of money, I would think, on something that really was mistreated and isn't effective. So how do people find something that they can trust? I know you've got a robust website of information for our listeners at Rawls MD, which we'll talk about later. But generally, what do people look for in terms of certifications?
Yeah, I think it is, looking around and finding reputable companies that are doing the right thing. And it's probably about half and half. There are a lot of companies out there spending a whole lot more on marketing hype than they are the actual product, the actual herb. And the key to that is if you go to a website and it just has all this marketing hype and it sounds so unbelievably convincing, but you're having a really hard time finding the actual ingredients of the product, that's a huge red flag. Run away. And I would say that's probably half of products out there. So being able to define what's in the product is really important. So what you're getting when, if you go to a health food store, if you get on the internet and you found an herbal product for sale, mostly what's available is what's called powdered herb, just a powdered whole herb. And basically what they do is they take the plant, the herb, they dry it, and they crush it into a powder, and they put it in a capsule. So mostly what you're getting is inert fiber. There's not very much phytochemistry there. If you're paying $15 for something, you're not going to get much. So kind of the step up from that is, and what most herbalists used are what are called herbal extracts or tinctures. And what they're doing with a tincture is they take the plant, the active parts of the plant, whether that's the roots or leaves or whatever, and they put that in water and alcohol. So the water and alcohol each extract a different spectrum of the chemicals from the plant, because you want to get that whole plant presence as much as you can. And then they discard the plant parts, so all you've got is the chemicals in the water and alcohol. For people who don't like alcohol, you can do glycerite extracts, but they're not as potent. They don't work quite as well. So those are pretty darn good. So it's hard to go wrong with a tincture. But what we use in our products and what I focus on with my recovery was standardized powdered extracts. So what they're doing there is they're taking that water alcohol tincture, spraying it on a surface, drying off the water and alcohol, and collecting the powder. So it's pure phytochemistry of the plant. So what you're getting there is 10 times more potent than that whole herb extract. And if you look at the capsules, looks like they look the same. They're both just capsules of powder, but one is 10 plus times more potent than the other. And so better companies are you going to use standardized extracts. So if you go in there and you find that they actually do put the ingredients where you can see them, you'll see if it says just list the name of the herb, especially if it's just the common herb and they give the milligram quantity, that's a whole herb powder. Go the other way. You're not getting much, except with rare exceptions. Or even worse, a proprietary blend that they're telling you, oh, it's 1,500 milligrams of all of these different herbs, but it doesn't give you any more information than that. They're going to put the least potent, cheapest herb in there, and that's what it mostly is. So run away from most proprietary blends. So what you want to find is that they've listed the common name, the scientific name, and they've put the milligram quantity of that herb, but it will also say standardized to one of the phytochemicals. So it's a standardization. So that's going to be a more concentrated product that's going to be better. Now, as far as is it the right herb? Is it free of chemical contaminants, biological contaminants, that sort of thing? That's testing. And so reputable companies do the added step of doing testing or requiring testing. So all of the extracts that we buy, we get a certificate of analysis that's a third-party testing. But even that, I mean, companies, you don't have to just go with what whoever's selling that extract got. Doing business with the same people who trace it out to the farm, so you've got some good information on where it came from and what it, how it was made, is important. But we take the extra step of taking a sample of that lot and testing it again to make sure that the certificate of analysis is real. And then most good manufacturing companies now do testing during the manufacturing process to make sure everything is blended right. That all adds cost. So you're going to pay a lot more for a really high quality product, but it's worth it. You're going to get the benefits that you're looking for.
Oh, yes. People waste way too much money on supplements, I think. Just kind of that false hope of, if I take something, then I'm going to get better, that desperation. So Dr. Rawls, you as an outdoorsman, I would think you had some fear about getting back outside once you started feeling better. How did you overcome that? And what do you do to protect yourself now?
There is always that fear in the back of your head, but I realized that, people are going to get tick bites. We get chigger bites, tick bites, mite bites. Mites live on our skin. We have things, and those things carry microbes. The fewer you get, the fewer opportunities microbes have to enter your body, the better. And so I think you do have to be careful. So when I'm out, I do a lot of hiking in a lot of places. I tend to go places that are a little bit drier and freer of ticks, but I've done a lot of hiking in Maine and New Hampshire too. And I used to do the full clothing thing that, you're clothed from head to toe. And now in the summertime, I wear shorts. And I just a mental thing. I'm vigilant. If something hits my leg, I immediately look down, and I typically find ticks whenever they get to me. I don't go through brush. I'm very careful about only going on open trails. But even then, sometimes trails that have a lot of leaf litter, you can still pick up a tick. So it's valuable. I don't use DEET or any heavy chemicals. I typically use essential oil sprays. I found that they are quite effective. What the plant is using essential oils for. The difference in an herb and essential oil is the essential oil is basically an insecticide that the plant is producing, and it keeps it in little vacuoles in its leaves. So essential oils are great insecticides and insect repellents, and they don't have the toxicity of all of the artificial petroleum-derived chemicals that we use. So, and then I take a shower, after I've gone for a long hike somewhere. I do a good tick check when I get back, and I go take a really good shower. Where you live is important. And interestingly, I live on the coast of North Carolina, and certain places have ticks, certain places don't. On our outer banks along North Carolina, there are deer on all the different islands. A lot of ticks. There are just ticks everywhere, and you have to really be careful about going back in the maritime forest. I live just slightly inland. I live on a marsh, and there are hiking trails, that go along the marsh here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I've never seen a tick here. It's the craziest thing. I don't know. We have a lot of raptors, hawks, and owls, and I'm wondering if they're eating the mice and keeping the mouse populations down. But we hike. I go for a walk in the woods every single day, and I haven't had a tick here yet. Knock on wood.
Wow, that's amazing. Years ago, probably 20 years ago, I was planting some black bamboo and that our Oklahoma City Zoo was getting rid of. Well, I picked up Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
Yeah.
And, I guess that's really probably dormant, right? According to everything you said, it probably could be reactivated.
Did you get Rocky Mountain spotted fever?
Well, they tested for it. I had a really good internal medicine physician who put me on doxycycline. I sort of thought, I'm glad you covered the ambiguous symptoms, because I was probably, 45 or 46 at the time, and like 20 years ago. And I thought, well, I'm in perimenopause. I just ignored it. And, a very high energy person, didn't really stop for anything. One day, Dr. Rawls, I woke up, it was like, I'm going to die today. Something is so wrong. I've got to get help, and had our doctor's cell number, and he called in doxycycline. So, from everything I know, I had it. And,
Yeah.
and it was kind of a long recovery, a long stint of doxycycline. Didn't know anything about, root cause, health, still probably quite bulletproof at that age. You were in your 40s when
Sure.
all this happened. You just kind of think, I'll rest a day and I'll be fine. But all that to say, we are in a very tick-infested country. We were big boy scouters, and so have used a lot of DEET.
Yeah.
Could you expound on specific, essential oils that you like for repellents?
Really any of them, and there are a lot of combinations. Eucalyptus is a good one. Tea tree oil is very nice. So here we're looking at herbs that you can put on your skin that don't irritate your skin. And there are a number of different products. A product made here in North Carolina that I've known about and carry a bottle is Murphy's Naturals. They make a really nice combination. So, but any of your essential oils are going to have insect repellent properties. And that's just the nature of the essential oils compared to the herbs. But not only that, if you're taking herbs, you're continually providing yourself with extra coverage against these things. So you mentioned Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and I think that's an interesting one just to compare to Lyme disease. And here we're talking about two different kinds of bacteria that have been, associated with the acute infection. So Lyme disease is Borrelia, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever is Rickettsia. But it's interesting that some of the original cases, those cases in Lyme, Connecticut, there was actually associations between a rickettsia species that lived there too. So even the pure form of Lyme disease may not have been completely Lyme disease. But the deal with the rickettsia, again, is the type of cells it invades. So when you look at Lyme disease, Borrelia specifically, and many of the other microbes, bacteria that come in ticks, they invade just random cells to the body. In Lyme disease, bacteria, Borrelia likes collagen, so it invades, nerve tissue and various kinds of tissue, and that's not necessarily going to cause acute symptoms. Rickettsia specifically invades the cells that line our small blood vessels, our small arteries, and our organs and our peripheral tissues, right? So because of that, because it invades those cells, if you get any kind of infection, it blocks blood flow and it kills tissue. So even though rickettsia may not be any more aggressive than Borrelia, because it's hitting the particular type of cell that makes us more vulnerable, it can be catastrophic. And quite frankly, when we look at acute tick bites and someone who is symptomatic, that rickettsia, because of that particular threat, that's probably the biggest reason why everybody ought to take antibiotics if they become symptomatic after a tick bite. Herbs are great too, and I always recommend do both. But for acute things, for fast-growing things, for things that are really that well-defined thing that can cause you harm, that's what an antibiotic's for. And that's where testing can sometimes be valuable. So yes, but very interestingly, I talk to people all the time that test positive for that rickettsia, but they didn't have Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So it can get in your body and not cause symptoms and just go dormant. But again, it's that cell type. It's because it affects small blood vessels and can cause blockage that it causes those acute symptoms. But another just really interesting tidbit on rickettsia. So we have mitochondria that power our cells, right? And there's good evidence that those mitochondria were ancient bacteria that were high energy bacteria that our cells picked up and basically just started outsourcing energy. It was an ancient rickettsia species that was a distant ancestor of the rickettsia that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is a pretty good indication of how long our relationship with intracellular bacteria has been going on.
Wow. Tell us more. As I was reading your info, tell us more about Japanese skullcap.
Oh, Chinese skullcap and Japanese
Head to
knotweed.
the
Yeah.
brain, Dr. Rawls, is why it was that's a quick U-turn there, but tell us about that.
Chinese skullcap is just a really nice herb. There are different varieties of skullcap all around the world. The American skullcap isn't quite as good an antimicrobial, but it's really good for calming stress. But Chinese skullcap is this really nice herb that it's immune modulator. It calms and balances immune system functions, calms, allergic reactions. But it's a great antimicrobial against a very wide range of microbes, mycoplasmas, viruses, Borrelia. So it's really nice. And then Japanese knotweed is another one that we commonly use. Great source of resveratrol that you find in wine, that age-defying substance. Well, Japanese knotweed is actually a better source. But again, that's not the only phytochemical. It has this wide range of immune modulating and antimicrobial substances within the plant too. So lots of different herbs. I mean, we could go on all day. There's andrographis and cat's claw, and they all have wonderful properties. One thing that I do, though, is with these kinds of herbs, I'm looking for things that are immune modulating. They balance immune system functions, not stimulate. So when you look at things for acute viral infections, echinacea elderberry, those kinds of things stimulate the immune system. So they're not things that you would want to use long term. So the difference is, the things that we're using, I'm looking for herbs that don't have drug-like effects, don't stimulate the immune system, that someone could take for months or even years. So yeah, there are certain guidelines that we use for things that we would pick for someone using long term, and then other herbs that maybe we wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, you have a very elegant Instagram. I would invite our listeners to follow you for
Thank
just
you.
these tidbits of, these clues on how to feel better very naturally. I really appreciate the point of the whole plant. It's never one thing. We so often, Dr. Rawls, want everything to be one thing, one diet, one exercise, one, whatever. And it's not.
Yeah.
It's the whole terrain. Just as a side note, do you ever use Nigella sativa, black seed oil, for anything?
Yeah. It's now there when you talk about black cumin seed oil, here we're talking about the pulling in some of the essential oil components of the plant. And with the essential oil, you have to be more careful about how you use it. So the difference in an essential oil and an herb is the herb is chemicals that the plant is using to protect cells or coordinate cellular function. So plants are using a lot of the same chemical messengers that our cells are using. So you're also getting that regulatory component from an herb, but it's all about protecting cells. So when you look at essential oils, the purpose is different. It's basically an insecticide. So the plant is taking those chemicals that we call terpenes and putting them inside a vacuole or a little bubble inside the leaves of the stems. And it's isolated from the cells because it's potentially toxic to cells. So when an insect comes along and starts chomping on the leaf or the stem of the plant, it releases these noxious substances and chases the insect away. Well, we're a lot bigger than an insect, and those substances do have anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties too, because they have some cell protective effects. So when you look at an essential oil, you've got something that is valuable, but there is a higher level of toxicity there also. And so you have to respect that. So I do use essential oils. There's some that are well tolerated on your skin. You can use tea tree oil but internally the few that you can use safely are oregano oil, black cumin seed oil, which has carbachol in it, one of the chemical components that's antimicrobial. Neem oil you can use internally, and you get them in little soft gels. But you have to be careful. These things I typically don't recommend that people use more than a few weeks because it will start irritating the gut. And so, but the three, black cumin seed is my favorite. It's a really nice essential oil. And you are getting some of the herbal components in that preparation. So it's not just purely an essential oil, but yes, it really has some nice applications.
One of the active ingredients is thymoquinone in black seed oil, Nigella sativa. It's effective. It has a lot of research on Fusobacterium nucleatum. And so I've done some very informal little studies here and there, doing a DNA analysis of the oral microbiome, seeing where things get. And from everything I can tell, it does not disrupt the good bacteria, the nitric oxide producing bacteria, but does lower Fusobacterium nucleatum. So that's why I brought it up. It's just one that I typically encourage my patients to use and give them a bottle actually to get them started.
Yeah. It's a really nice thing to have in your toolbox. And it's not covering that one bacteria. I always caution people that, it's affecting all potential pathogens and not at the expense of your normal flora. So, you get this really nice effect, and there's just no antibiotic that can do that, I mean, I tell people all the time that just be careful with antibiotics because there is a place for them. I mean, the world would be at a loss without them, but we've overused them so much, and we haven't made any new antibiotics since the 80s. It cost a couple $1 billion to bring a new drug to market, and the pharmaceutical companies are interested in things that people take for a lifetime that don't make them well, not things that might cure them for something. So they haven't made new antibiotics. There's bacterial resistance to all antibiotics. And the more you use them, the more you grow antibiotic resistant pathogens in your body and contribute to that bigger problem. So when you look at chronic Lyme disease, it's a huge problem. And people do die of it because, of other complications of it, because it just is basically contributing to bad health. Antibiotic-resistant pathogens kill 1 million people every year, and that's been growing. It's been happening every year since the 80s and 90s, and it grows every year. It's an enormous problem. And so for acute infections, save your antibiotics for when you get something acute that you really need it, and be careful with them.
Well, you've given a lot of hope for Lyme sufferers because so many times they come in and they're like, well, I'm a Lyme patient. That becomes their identity,
Yeah.
Dr. Rawls. And I tell them that's not their identity. So I appreciate, the comprehensive work you've done. It makes me picture the garden, sort of like you plant your garden and there's this little area that doesn't get good water, or maybe it's in the shade, and that's where all the bugs go.
Right.
That's where you find all the squash bugs or whatever, the plant that's not robust and not getting the nutrients it needs. So that's sort of how we are in terms of
Yeah.
susceptibility. So folks, I can really see why, after talking to you, I can see why you wrote Cellular Wellness after writing your book on Lyme disease. I mean, it's just a more general thing. So this is not just about Lyme disease. This, as Dr. Rawls said, is about MS. This is about fibromyalgia. This is about memory loss, brain fog. This is about insomnia. This is probably about infertility. This is about autoimmunity. This is about type 2 diabetes. So many of these things help regulate blood sugar.
Yeah.
So thank you. You're improving relationships. You really
Well,
are.
thank you. Yeah, I always challenge people, don't be your diagnosis. Move beyond your symptoms and beyond your diagnosis, and focus on the things that are making you sick. And the bacteria are part of that, but that's not the whole thing. You've got to take care of your whole body, your whole terrain. You have to have a true holistic approach and get well and move beyond it and go do great things with your life,
I make people stand in front of the mirror and say, I am not my diagnosis. I am a child of the living God. My body is designed to heal. I just have to give my body what it needs to help it get well. I mean, I make people say these affirmations
I think
because
that's
I
great.
think that's really part of healing, just the power of the power of the spoken word. So thank you. Tell our listeners about the richness on your website, about Vital Plan, and what they can harness from your experiences.
Well, thank you. Probably the best connection is rawlsmd.com/resources, and that'll give them a lot of information. With my daughter, I co-founded a supplement company really because in my practice, I wanted my patients to have herbs and I couldn't find any good products. And we eventually started having products made, and we've been building on that for a decade. And so we've created a company that's not just a producer of supplements. I've designed programs, and we have a community, and just it's all about that holistic approach to getting well, to moving beyond your diagnosis, to getting your life back. And so, we're really passionate about it.
You are. You're changing the world. So I will put all of this in the show notes, Dr. Rawls, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
Well,
You're
thank
someone
you.
I admired from a distance via Instagram, and I thank you for your content there.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's changing the world. Yep, it's really important.
And it's super fun. And thank you, listeners. You're the reason this podcast is growing. We're now in 137 countries and almost 5,500 cities. And that's because you all are smart about social media, smarter than me. But I am now on Instagram. So join me on Instagram, join me on YouTube, and join Dr. Rawls. And just go out there, live your passion, fulfill your purpose. Blessings until next time.
Thanks for joining us on Vitality Made Simple podcast. Be sure to visit drdebbieosment.com for our courses and resources designed to help you feel better, look better, and enjoy better relationships. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for joining us.